I'm Stephen Sewell. I'm the chair of this fantastic discussion panel. Michelle Arrow, Wesley Enoch, and the wonderful Julian Merrick. But before we proceed, Wesley has just told me the terrible news that I hadn't heard, and that I
just want to use some space here just to talk about Andrew Ross and his amazing contribution, especially to a lot of blackfella writing and theatre making. And that notion too, that his passing yesterday from a very long illness, just to acknowledge it as much as anything else. I don't think we would have had the plays of Jack Davis without his amazing contribution, or Corrugation Road and Brand New Day without Andrew Ross's contribution and support. And we wouldn't have Black Swan Theatre Company, I guess, without Andrew Ross, let alone other things like his contribution to the the Powerhouse. That's really getting on my nerves. Is that all right? There we go. That's much better. Thank you. And also his early days in Brisbane, working with what was La Boite at the time, and just I think that it's important that we mark the contribution of our elders, and when they pass, that we celebrate their contribution to our collective goal of making theatre, writing onto the national storytelling, our creativity and thoughtfulness, and just mark this idea that people pass and we can't change that. I think Andrew was talking about that very clearly, this kind of sense that there is this cycle of life that happens, and that these elders influence us along the way, and hopefully we keep them alive in our work and our memories as we go forward as well.
Andrew came to and critiqued my first academic paper. It was in Perth, and he liked it. And afterwards, I was at the University of Western Australia, and he walked me round the grounds because his father and his grandfather were both landscape gardeners. And so he talked to me all about the trees and the different things were planted, because he had that knowledge too. And he was a good friend of mine thereafter.
Wow. Anyway, for everyone who knew Andrew Ross, sorry for your loss. And for those who didn't know him, I think that sense that you have known him through his work and through the things that we have all inherited from his contribution. So it's just to mark that. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Wesley. And Julian too, yes. So the topic for this panel is talking to history. After the wonderful discussions this morning and Andrew's very honest and beautiful descriptions of his processes and his life, I'm going to lead us in the opposite direction, from the sublime into the ridiculous. And I want to begin by asking someone, putting it out there, if you can guess which Australian government minister said this: "Artistic and creative expression is at the heart of cultural and creative industries and of our identity. The reinvigorated artistic program will give a boost to our stories that resonate globally and nurture our artists and creators, producers, distributors and exhibitors, so badly hit by the pandemic. By supporting collaboration across the value chain and linguistic borders, as well as new innovative models, we will bolster a vibrant and culturally diverse audiovisual and theatrical ecosystem. For the first time and at a time of growing threats, the creatives will also promote a healthy and sustainable news medium." Blah, blah.
Sounds like Peter Dutton to me.
Very, very close. Needless to say, it's a trick question. It wasn't an Australian minister at all. It was the EU Commissioner of Culture announcing, I believe, a 32% increase in their budget to several $billions. Now, keep that in your minds, because I hope that through this conversation that we're going to have today, we're going to end up with a bit of with an idea of what kind of culture and what kind of environment we want in Australia, and how we might be able to get there from where we are now. But that's the sort of the big plan, the overall plan. Where I want to start initially is with Julian. And Julian's wonderful, wonderful book, 50 Australia in 50 Plays. Now, what Julian does in that book that's heartening and thrilling is to give an account of Australian theatre within the struggle, contextualises it as a crucial truth process. That theatre is a truth process, a crucible within which we can discover ourselves, and that makes a direct contribution not just to the cultural life of the country, but to the political and ideological history, future of the country as well. I would like to ask Julian now to just give us your views on the value of what we do and of theatre.
Yeah. All you have to do is look. There's nothing that needs to be advocated for or pushed beyond what the historical record itself shows. Just turn back and look. The past and the present are not separate zones of existence. They're all part of the same current. So whichever year you choose, whichever decade you choose, you will see, I have seen, some unusual, surprising, confronting, interesting, amazing, funny connection between the plays Australians were doing at that time and the life that they were leading. And the relationship between the two of them is both mysterious and magical on the one hand, and direct and extremely informative on the other. It's there at the time of Federation, and the year that I particularly focus on is 1912, and that's a particularly interesting year for me because it's a year in which the 20th century has yet to happen. And so when you read the plays, the hard thing for us now is to unknow what we know, is to unknow World War I, unknow World War II, unknow the Holocaust, unknow the threat of nuclear war, and to connect with the hope in those plays. Similarly, in the 1940s, this extraordinary year that I can never quite get out of my mind, 1942, when John Curtin couldn't sleep because he was sure that the Australian army that was coming back from the Western Desert on the boats would get bombed by the Japanese. And if you know your military history, then in a war such as World War II, you could basically lose it in 10 minutes. So if the Japanese Air Force had found those troop carriers, that was going to be curtains for curtain. And yet this particular year, thank you, that's a dad joke, this particular year, 1942, is also the year when he writes an introduction to a journal on Australian art. Curtin does. I have a copy of it, which I keep on my desktop, and which, for quite amazing plays, take place all in this year. And you're just like, okay, well, that's really interesting. What does that say about the country at this time? That it should be growing in confidence, or hope, or whatever word you want to call it, at the very time that it is looking into the abyss from a military point of view. If you go further forward into the 1980s and 1990s, which is, I think, a difficult journey. I talk a bit about Richard Franklin's Conversations with the Dead, and I find that a very difficult play to read, even though I know Richard. But it's amazing how you can think you know something, and then actually when you go back and you connect with it again, then you experience it all over again. And that play does several things. First of all, it expresses Richard's vision and understanding of the Destin custody inquiry that he had been part of. But it also links back to the submerged Australian expressionist theatre tradition that goes all the way back to Sidney Tomholt in the 1930s and 1940s. And you can take a ruler and just draw a line from Sidney Tomholt to Richard Frankland. And that says to me that something collective is going on. And I think I've got all sorts of sentences where in the book where I try and sort of say this, but one of the things I say is, not about every play, but some plays I say, this is a drama intent of thinking for the nation. This is how a nation thinks on stage. So don't ask playwrights what they think, look at their plays and listen to them think. And that is an amazing thing to do, because plays also do lots of other things, like they're very entertaining and they tell you amazing stories and so forth. But they also have very powerful points of view in their heart. And by communicating them, they do this amazing trick of time-binding history. And by doing that, I think they help us cope with the future, because that's the most important thing about the past, is what it tells us about what to do now. And several people have asked me about this brooch. I'll just mention it now. A young jeweler made it for me in Melbourne, a friend of my son's, very young. It is the god Janus, and I wanted to have it as part of me from this point onwards, because one face faces back to the past to understand the past, and the other face, I think the one with the eyes closed, is kind of my direction with new work, facing into the present and the future. So it's only when we have those two faces that we can really understand our place in time.
Thank you. That was beautiful. What I find so thrilling is that you're articulating a hope and an ambition that everyone in theatre believes in, but in the kind of normal bustle of life, we frequently lose sight of, and in the face of the constant assault on our art by our political masters, we've lost hope. I feel myself, I've lost hope that we are a little bit more than monkey grinders, providing entertainment for the masses, as is that appears to be the kind of prevailing idea of what we do. And you're saying, au contraire, what we do is crucially important to our sense of understanding of ourselves and our sense of identity.
Yeah.
Now, Wesley, I want to turn to you. Because you're a master, you have a much more profound idea of the role of culture in survival than I think I ever could have. And I'd like you to speak to that if you could.
Oh, thank you. This idea that when we were trying to seat ourselves, it's almost like there was a fight to sit on the edges. Oh. That we all wanted to sit on the fringes, and kind of because the centre is such a contested area. And I was joking before about going, no, actually, I want to be in the centre because I want to be the one who's kind of out there trying to say something. Often for, I think, in First Nations theatre makers, there is a big cultural project at work. And just listening to what Julian was saying, often what we saw in the past was that the commercial interests and those kind of cultural interests had some kind of relationship in the past that maybe we've separated artificially in this last 20, 30 years. But the great cultural project for First Nations people is to make sure that we are not made invisible and that we are constantly there. That the lived experience of most Australians is that there is not a personal relationship with First Nations Australians or the cultural knowledge of First Nations Australians. Again, a lot of that shifting and changing in the last, let's call it 30 years, maybe the last 50 years. And just as a function of having such a small population in relation to... So we've got basically the Aboriginal population's basically the population of Tasmania, except we don't get 12 senators. So that notion of the lived experience and connection means that we are constantly looking for ways of making sure our stories are told onto the public record, and so that there is a cultural purpose to that narrative being told. I mean, I sometimes feel levels of pity for non-Indigenous writers who may not have a clearly articulated cultural project to contribute to. And sometimes I worry that a lot of non-Indigenous writers love form because it's acting as a surrogate for content. There, I'm just going to say it. Do controversial things. Put it out there. So often we go, oh, what's form? Oh, form is all of this stuff. You go, yeah, but form is in fact a servant of content. And so unless you have something really important to say, the theatre then becomes this very shallow thing for me. So for a lot of First Nations writers, there is a cultural project that we are contributing to, and we are trying to make shifts and changes. And when you know, Gary Foley, we talked yesterday too about Uncle Bob Mazza, Bobby Merritt, who were out there saying, we are here to educate non-Indigenous Australia about the Australian experience, provide a window into our lived experience, our way of seeing the world. We're also there to celebrate our survival and a sense of placement in the world, that we're trying to say we have not disappeared. And talking to Nathan Maynard about this, his vehemence that they have not gone, that we were all taught in schools that a black line wiped out all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, and his vehemence and his passion to say, no, we are not invisible, we are here, we are an unbroken continuation of that practice, is such a... Well, I think we've all seen his passion at work there as well. And then I think there's this sense of what do we do with that celebration and that education, but create a pathway for a preferred future. So we're constantly saying, look at this image, look at this image. And I just go back one step to this idea of, in 1967, the pan-Aboriginal experience existed, which was we all had to be one and speak with one voice to create the kind of change that made the 67 referendum. When we're now talking about the next series of referenda that may occur for the voice to Parliament, we are already a diverse voices. We're out there going, actually, here are university-educated black fellas with pale skin. Here are people living on country, dealing with poverty issues and isolation issues. There's all of this kind of diversity that's already manifest, and that's being used against us a lot, because the window that we've provided is a truthful window that shows the country how diverse we are. And that isn't about disunity. It's about saying, look at all the different aspects of our response to that world. And so now the greatest danger, I was talking to my cousin who works for the Statement from the Heart, and he was saying that's the biggest issue, is that we have been allowing Australia to see our diversity and understand our arguments and our internal ructions, and we've been giving them access to all of that for a good 50 years, and that's one of the major stumbling blocks of us going forward, that we are no longer perceived to be this pan-Aboriginal experience as one unit going forward. And so do we change that? Do we say the great cultural project now is to deny that diversity within the Aboriginal experience and give a united front forward? Or are we actually saying educate everyone that that's the normal part of what we do, and it makes people feel incredibly uncomfortable? Whereas I think in our celebration and education modes, we've been incredibly welcoming and pulling people in, and now we're saying, okay, here's the other side of that. Here's this kind of discomfort and ruction and painful kind of power that's been coming out of it, and we can't rely on the white guilt for us to go forward. We have to look at our whole sense of pride about that diversity of experiences in this continent.
Wonderful.
Oh, aren't you lovely? Shut up.
I've got a couple of points.
Thank you.
The very first one is that listening to you, I realise that there's a kind of negative answer to the power of culture colonialism provides us. The colonialists did everything they could to destroy your culture, the First Nations culture, starting from getting rid of language, through to stealing children and inculcating them, removing them from cultural activities. That's the only reason they're doing that, or that they did that, well, they are doing that, continue to do that. The only reason they're doing that is because they know that culture is what is protecting you.
Agreed. And that notion too of, we know that by having a cultural voice, mostly through sport and art, is the way that we can step forward. And so we've been doing that a lot as well. I mean, it's interesting, we say culture, but in fact, we could almost say culture is power. You know, the idea of who has the pulleys and levers and the controls for culture actually has power over a whole group of people. That's what culture is.
Absolutely right. And that's my second point, which is that there's a kind of model that people like Dutton and those sorts of political people have, that culture should be unifying. That culture is a uniform that we put on. You know, I'm an Australian, so I look like this, and I talk like this, and if I don't look like that, if I don't look like the way I am, if I don't talk the way I should, then I'm a disruptor. But my view, and I want to talk to you, Michelle, about this point, or ask you about this point. My view, on the contrary, is that culture is most vibrant when it is most divisive. When it is full of contradiction, when it is full of rage and humour, and, you know, do you want to talk to that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I'm trying to, you know, putting my historian's hat on, because, you know, I mean, one of the things that I love about Julian's book is that it brings theatre into the kind of national story, really, you know, and makes the claim that those two things, you know, you need both to understand each other. You know, that you need theatre and drama to understand Australian history, and you need Australian history to understand theatre and drama. I think if you know, thinking about sort of the power of divisive culture versus, you know, I guess that idea of a sort of common nationalist, you know, happy, everyone's, you know, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of a good example. If you think about the bicentenary in '88, you know, that there was an attempt, I think, around the bicentenary to make that exactly that kind of unified celebration. We're going to just, everybody's going to celebrate the nation, and we're going to have these, you know, if everyone remembers that video of the, you know, the ad on television of all these white faces standing in front of Uluru singing about celebration of a nation. But of course what that did was provoke this counter response, which people went, you can't do that. Like, that's, you know, the idea of doing a sort of monocultural celebration was ridiculous. And the government tried to split the difference by saying, oh, we're not celebrating a nation, we're living together, I think ended up being the kind of slogan. You know, but of course the most powerful message that comes out of '88 is white Australia has a black history. You know, and that seeds so much kind of political debate, historical debate and historical writing, and of course cultural, you know, work. So I think attempts to create monocultures often produce the opposite. They produce the kind of counter, which of course ends up being much more vibrant and provokes other kinds of change and other kinds of inclusion. So I think that that's probably a really good point. That,
well, yes, where I thought you were going to begin was the eruption of women's writing and women's theatre as in the 70s and the 80s, into what had been a predominantly male...
Very male space.
Yeah. And how exciting that was.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think one of the things about looking at that period of La Mama and the Australian Performing Group in the 1970s is that it is incredibly... it catches people's eye. It catches that moment of the new nationalism, of the Whitlam era, of the ochre in film, and, you know, it takes on this momentum as, you know, we are kind of scrutinising the nation, and we're scrutinising the nation largely through men and masculinity. That kind of becomes the way that that's done. And then one of the interesting things about that is that provokes this counter-reaction from, for example, the women within the Australian Performing Group who say, we're going to do a play about women's experience. And they're trotting off to the State Library and they're reading historical records that they'd never read before, that they were discovering their own history as they were doing that. And then it provokes, you know, it kind of grows into feminist theatre, it grows into feminist experiments in filmmaking, it grows into the Women's Film Fund, which then funds a lot of experimental work. So again, I think, you know, those kind of moments of disruption and eruption can often be incredibly generative. And I think, again, Julian's book shows the ways that those can be, you know, those debates and really fierce divisions about what it means to be Australian can then provoke a pluralising effect around that.
Yes, that question, what does it mean to be an Australian, doesn't have an answer.
No.
And that's what's exciting about it.
Yeah.
No.
The question is so much more interesting.
Yeah.
Like this whole conversation about the 26th of January and our National Day and all that kind of stuff. And I go, actually, the debate about what is Australian is so much more vibrant and interesting than some kind of, oh, we need to have, you know, park a big fucking warship in Circular Quay and have a big kind of fireworks display. That I think that's what's arrived at our shores now, is this conversation about what it means to be Australian, not just about this official culture that gets placed upon us.
Yes, yes. And I wonder, Julian, if the issue has been that we've allowed ourselves at an ideological level to be put into a corner, pushed into a corner, and gone, yeah, sorry, you're right. You know, it actually is about bums on seats, and fuck, we just can't do it. You know, give the money to someone who can.
Yeah, that would be. I mean this without any kind of rhetoric or side. That's all just a lie. You know, it's just all. It's you don't have to believe it. I absolve you from taking any of those arguments seriously again. You know, when I have my policy hat on and I'm looking at things, you know, from a political economic angle, it's all garbage there too. So I put on my other hat and say, don't worry about that now. That's not important. What is important is the kinds of conversations that we've been having over the last 2 days. That's the value, if you like, and I suppose the big question is, what do you want to do with it?
Yeah.
Where do you want to go next?
Yeah.
The book, practically, but also, I think philosophically, finishes just before the pandemic. And that's because I had no idea of the moment that we were in. And I was like, okay, I'll just put the suitcase down here then, and take off the historian's gown, and like everybody else, go back into the present moment and hope that we can work it out together.
I think I'm about to say something really stupid, but Nietzsche began his journey, his philosophical journey, by contemplating Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
What it was and why it was.
Yeah.
And his view, if I understand it correctly, is that Greek tragedy, the beauty of Greek tragedy, didn't arise from some wonderful aesthetic that the Greeks had, that they incorporated. But on the contrary, what the power of the Greeks was that they had incredible conflict.
Yeah.
And conflicts within their culture, within their society, that through the artistic process they were able to transcend.
Yes. So there's a name for that, which is the argon, and it comes from the Greek juridical system. And Shaki was talking a little bit about this yesterday. It means two equally persuasive but opposed points of view.
Yep.
And so drama has the unique capacity to incorporate that within its theatrical forms as a form of argument and as a form of embodied argument. So it's not so great at showing tanks coming through sand dunes. I don't know if that's, you know, so I don't know if Andrea's here. I'd forget the revolves, Andrea. I don't think theatre's great with that, to be honest. But it is uniquely good at doing something else, which is showing the consequences and pursuing them. So it becomes a very useful forensic tool in the way that Andrew was suggesting, as a mode of discovery, because of its patterning through time, because of the way it can release information through time. It can take people on their own journey through discovering something that it wants to say, which occasionally can be so insightful that we would give it the word a truth.
Yes, yeah, well, I totally believe that.
Can I, just this idea that, contemporary management theory kind of coming into the same kind of idea that if you actually have a room full of people who all think the same way and all agree, you're more likely to create very shallow ideas. That if everyone agrees all the time, that there's a sense that it's not been tested by having different cultural viewpoints, different individuals, or the kind of neurodiversity in a decision-making room. So why do we have in our major corporations such incredible fuck-ups all over the place? It's often because we don't have a diversity of thinking around that decision-making process. Now, take that as a microcosm. On a countrywide model, why we need diverging voices, why we need critique and debate and discussion, is because we end up creating a very narrow base for what we're building if it's just based on, the bums on seat conversation or everyone's agreeing. And I think in the last 10 years, we could even go back further, the attack on ideas and thinking has been interesting. Universities, public broadcasting, journalism as a whole, the idea of theatre and arts, that this kind of funding model and shifting the focus away from diverging voices and battles to, battles of ideas on our stages, to a kind of, as long as it's got bums on seats, or if it doesn't have bums on seats, then it's got to be so culturally specific that no one else can read it. And I worry about that as this kind of progression goes on as well. We pay lip service often to, here's our multicultural show, or here's our blackfella show, as opposed to embracing the ideas in everything that we're doing and the debate that happens everywhere. I think Nakia said it yesterday best when she was saying, we don't talk about the Sydney Opera House being a white place, but we do talk about having a black theatre company or things like that.
Yes. I feel myself, and let me just put this, and Michelle, perhaps you can address it. I feel myself that we are at a really incredible turning point in history. The turning point may be into total disaster and catastrophe under the auspices of Mr. Putin, but also, and maybe an and yes, or rather than no. It could also be a moment of great liberation, I think, internationally. And what I'm thinking of, especially, is that era that Ronald Reagan began at his inaugural address, when he said, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem," may finally be over. And those adherents of that philosophy have shown themselves to have basically destroyed the infrastructure and the national fabric across the world. There has been no adequate response to the COVID disaster, the environmental disaster, the recent floods here in Australia. It's just been a complete shambles, and a shambles arising directly out of a philosophy that says government is the problem. And that shamble, is what has affected us in theatre for the last 20 years, at least. Our theatre has been destroyed. Like at this conference, listening to all these beautiful writers talking about how they don't write for theatre anymore. They're writing for television, they're writing for film, they're writing for, not because they're turning their back on theatre, but because the theatres have actually closed their doors.
I mean, it's interesting with, I think at the early days of the pandemic, I feel like there was a sort of sense that idea of, get government out of our lives was over, because we sort of had to turn to the state, and there was a sort of exposure, I suppose, of the limits of that idea, because suddenly we couldn't all as individuals make choices to procure vaccines, or we couldn't make decisions about, you know, how we were going to make sure that all those people who were thrown out of work were going to be looked after, you know. And so I feel like there was a bit of optimism, even in the kind of depths of that moment. I remember when they kind of declared the JobKeeper scheme, and of course we know what we know about it now, that there were all sorts of problems with it. But at that moment, it felt like something good had happened, because the government had taken responsibility and kind of, you know, abandoned those ideas, I suppose, of small government. But of course, you know, 2 years on, I don't think that anyone has optimism about that moment anymore. We know that it was rorted. We know that, you know, government is trying to do a gas-led recovery rather than, you know, a culture and knowledge and arts-led recovery. You know, they've cut money from universities. They've done all of the things that we, you know, expect these governments to do. But I guess too that there's something, I feel like, you know, Julian's book is coming at an interesting moment, because there is a moment, I feel, of, you know, really for the last 20 years or so, there's been a fairly, I don't know if it's been defined by the arts sector or if it's been imposed on it, but a kind of sense of endless culture wars going on.
Yes.
And I think, you know, that has been, I think the response from people in the arts has often been to sort of withdraw or to kind of not think about addressing the nation anymore, or not contemplating that question. And I think that's probably got to change, because I think there has to be, because that's being met with is guys with flags tied around their necks, you know, yahooing on Australia Day. Like, and I kind of think you can't allow the right to define those ideas. I think that you have to be a player in that space, and that's where I see possibly some optimism, because I do think we're at a moment where some things are up for grabs that they haven't been for a little while.
Though I think, you know, we're more likely to have a gas-lit recovery than a gas... Well, because...
Both!
Well, yeah. Patricia said, Wesley, you do the words. Yeah. No, but there is this thing where we keep being told one thing, that what I'm hearing you say too, Stephen, is this idea of there is a strong collective vibe going on, and Michelle, this notion of we have to work together, we have to work as communities, we have to find ways of resilience together that individualism can't provide for us. Yeah. And yet we're still, in a lot of our kind of high-level conversations, still talking about individuals. You know, yes, there's Putin, and Putin's in, but actually, what's the collective power behind him is more interesting to me. I want to hear the stories of everyday Russians and why they want to get into Ukraine, why they think that's important, because Putin must be a manifestation of that collective, or he wouldn't do it, that collective goal. And in the same way in this country, you know, I don't want to hear Scott Morrison talk about the voice to Parliament, because I don't think it's his responsibility. That government is, in fact, a manifestation of our collective ambitions. And we're not hearing enough of that collective ambition being spoken. And theatre is, you know, Pollyanna, put your boots on. Theatre is a place where that collective voice can and should be heard and should be expressed.
Yeah, absolutely. No question.
Well, history says that too.
Yeah, it does. And also the form. the form comes from the same, it's related to the political, to the agora, to the, you know, where we work out our differences and, you know, decide to invade another Greek island, or whatever it was that they did back then. I was just going to say something about the historical record in Australia, because I think it's kind of useful to know, that perhaps explains a little bit about the moment that we're in, which is the fear, I would say the extreme fear on the Australian Conservative right, including the centre-right, of anything like socialism, anything like it. And it's easy to forget, because the Berlin Wall has collapsed and, you know, Putin is now, you know, Putin. It's easy to forget how all-important that debate was. Really from the 1890s, you know, when it was such a terrible depression in Australia, and the site of many industrial conflicts. And you can feel this, like it's, in fact, you can't avoid it. when you look at the plays, this struggle. I don't know a body of work where almost every play from Federation to 1950 is about working class characters. You know, like a few middle class people in there, but lots of middle class characters. Whereas the UK really had to wait until the 1950s before they got anything like that. So, you know, there's a real sense of the struggle for the nation, and then when you look at the politics and you look at how frightened the coalition were when Gough Whitlam got into power, and the dismissal, and there's so much talk around the dismissal, and I was just like, hang on, this isn't right. You know, like, never mind the logic, the outcome is disgraceful. How come they were allowed to do it? And, you know, there you go to the website, and on the Parliament website, there's a big sign going, yeah, we got it wrong. We really fucked up. And I think all of that is driven by fear. Fear that somehow this socialism is going to escape out of a bottle. And then when you get into the 1990s, well, the game changes. And whatever that body of ideas is supposed to represent, that gets put in a little box, and somebody gets a little hammer out, and they try and hammer all those ideas down. And then they try and bury the box and pretend that it never existed. And I reckon that box is, you know, you can hear the knocking from inside the box now. So what it...
The knocking that the playwrights have performed.
Yeah, that's
Well,
right.
yes. But we playwrights, we artists inside the coffin,
As well.
part of our solution, I think, would be to reclaim, as you did, Wesley, the actual direction of art, of the festivals, for the artists to replace the accountants and the political appointees, and free the box. Free ourselves out of the box. Is that what you think?
Well, and yes, I agree, and I think that I'll go back to Ralph Myers. Was it a Philip Parsons that Ralph Myers did, where he talked about the kind of corporatisation of the arts, and that then we all became more and more about commodities, and playwrights then became, well, what can you deliver to an audience along the way? And this notion of how do we as artists centre ourselves in this kind of conversation, and how do we gather those skills? Running big theatre companies, running a festival has been great, but it's interesting the tensions that are there, which are all economic tensions, which say, where we talked about Anthem before when Andrew was speaking, and you go, a brand new work of that scale and the kind of resources that go into it, and people saying, yes, but it's cheaper to bring in an international work that already knows what it is, and we can put it into that theatre and it doesn't have to... There's these conversations that happen in these organisations which are not about the art, and therefore it's about the marketing. When I was at the Queensland Theatre Company, one of my major failings was that the marketing department became the largest department in that company, with no increase in audience. And you're going, well, what happened? What was that about? And should we have spent that money by going, okay, let's give away all the tickets, let's make them free, let's only do brand new work, let's commission artists to create all this work and allow audiences to come like they're going to an art gallery and experience this kind of cultural conversation without needing to make it a financial transaction. And that's heresy in this world. And so therefore we're all caught in that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about the visual arts in this way. We don't talk about museums and libraries in this way. Yes, they might have one-off exhibitions, but we do talk about the performing arts in particular as an economic transaction between those listening to the stories and those telling the stories. And that playwrights, I think, have been cajoled and trained into that kind of discussion as well. I mean, David Williamson was going to be on this panel, and I wish he was, because, God, I love that tall, cranky old bastard.
He's cranky.
And I'd say it to his face, so it's not, but this wonderful kind of sense that he says, but where's the joy, Wesley? Where's the joy? And you go, that joy is not absent from ideas. We can have big conversations and debates and still be joyful and celebratory and thoughtful along the way. And I love this sense that, I said this to him on the phone when we had that chat, saying, but David, your plays are full of ideas and full of conflict and debate and kind of smacking up against each other. But the sense of sometimes the discussion is all about, no, we can only put forward the marketing kind of image of it being joyful and celebratory and placatory, if that's such a word, placates the audience, rather than making you feel discomfort. Now, can I just do one last thing about discomfort, which is my little bugbear at the moment, that in the last, let's call it 10 to 15 years, discomfort has been labelled as wrong. If you're feeling discomfort, if you're feeling uncomfortable about an idea, about a discussion that's going on, somehow that is wrong. Whereas before, I think we used to, and I don't want to be too nostalgic, but discomfort was often a spur to go, well, why am I feeling that? What's that about? Is there something to learn? Why are you thinking that and you're thinking that? Well, we must get together and have a conversation about it. And that almost the Hansen-esque kind of idea of this idea of I'm feeling uncomfortable, then you need to be pushed away from me, is something that will be incredibly dangerous going forward.
Confused, that's another one. Oh, I'm confused, so you must be doing something wrong because I'm confused, rather than, no, actually you have to work this out.
And this is the bread and butter of Playwrights, to actually create that moment where we take people to the precipice of discomfort and ructions inside and kind of confusion and ideas that are confronting to us, and to talk it all out so our mirror neuron can go, oh, I'm watching that happening, I'm learning as I'm going.
Yeah. And you can see that in the history of something like the New Theatre Movement, is that, all of those plays that they're putting on, a lot of them are about trying to work out an issue. Like, what do we do? And of course, it's done in a way that is characteristic of its time. It's how do we deal with the Aboriginal problem or the Indigenous, what do we do with those issues? But you can see a very sincere attempt to kind of try and work those things through. And you can see it in the letters that they're getting from people in the audience, that some people love it and some people hate it. And that kind of sense of conflict and contestation, and trying to commission plays about particular ideas because they want to explore things. Yeah. And the left is trying to come up with, positions on debate, and this is all part of the debate that the broader left is having in that moment.
And in the pattern of production, there's the new, you do the show, but then there's the discussion afterwards.
Yes.
So the whole event is a more extended exchange, of which the show is only really one part, and then that becomes part of the argon.
Yes.
Debaters, people.
Could I say, like, what you're all talking about, in my view, is the politics of theatre, and like going back to the Greeks, you could, we know that the Greek theatre was in that mould. That's the way they perceived it. It was a publicly funded or funded through private subscription, private patronage, publicly funded performances that the the Athenians were required to
Compulsory.
attend. Yeah, that's right.
Had to go.
They used to put them in jail if they didn't go to the theatre.
They just fined them. Still pretty good.
Not quite, but because they were so progressive, they didn't have jails. But that it was they understood that that process that you're talking about of here are two wonderful ideas at loggerheads.
Yeah.
Now let's work out ourselves what our attitude to it, and that being part of the political process.
Yeah, they had I think a particular idea of what drama could do, and everyone will have their own view of what politics is. But I think the ancient Greeks felt that the danger with political rhetoric was that it could peel away from experience, and that you would just get caught up in these walls of words that no longer related to the actual human consequences that got felt when people did the things they said they were going to do. So they would go to the theatre really as a way of sticking all the Sophia, that was pure knowledge, back into the human dilemma, and produce phronesis, this
Yeah.
kind of pragmatic wisdom that went, don't do this because it's really shit. You might think it's good in theory, but in practice, when we see it through, the story of the House of Atreus shows that it doesn't end well. So it performed a very important function within a democracy of allowing people to embody their experience without having to get caught up in some of the formalities of rational debate. Didn't mean that debate wasn't in it, meant there were a whole load of other things as well.
Yes, and that point that you just made about its role within democracy,
That's right.
a democracy, is, to my mind, the crucial role.
It is.
And when in Australia, we had art in working life, and we had heavily subsidised theatre tickets that ordinary people could go to the theatre, the nature of the theatre was different to what it is now.
Yes.
What it is now is primarily, an expensive form of whatever. I mean, it still has a cultural value and a cultural significance, but a very different cultural significance to what it did have.
Yes, because its function within that great vision, and I think the Art and Working Life programme, which I know very well, is a good example of it, was to bring people in. People who were out, bring them in, so that they could participate and we could have some collective insight into the pluralism that is a contemporary democracy.
Yes. So I don't think, this is my thesis anyhow, I don't think that where we are now in our decaying theatrical culture is a mistake or an oversight. I think it's a deliberate policy to depoliticise, to de-democratise, to turn it into an elite form of entertainment that is exclusive of other people.
Well, and flattering. That our theatre has become incredibly flattering, perhaps.
Yep.
So, and that's why, I love so many people's work. Let's talk about Patricia Cornelius for a quick second. Like, it's a kind of warts and all. It's actually flattering because it's a real insight into these amazing characters who are kind of coming through and speak to us with such honesty. And I do worry that sometimes we create some works which are just about flattering us and keeping us in our own way of thinking at the moment. I mean, one of the things, like what I love about Nakia's work, Blackie, Blackie, Brown, is that it pushes outside of that, but then you go, White is the New Black is actually about flattering that audience and bringing them in and saying, now follow me into Blackie, Blackie, Brown, I think. And so there are these kind of games. You get works like The Sapphires, which are incredibly lovely and flattering and familiar, and you get works like Conversations with the Dead, and you get a whole range of things. It's about how we balance all of that out, and how, as programmers, as people who are in positions of decision-making power, actually making sure that balance is happening and that we're getting a diversity of those stories being said. And I don't know if that's the case. I was very critical.
No, you're there.
Oh, watch out. I was just going to say something. I was very, very critical and still remain critical of some of what Brett was doing at MTC, which I think was creating a commercial entity within a funded structure. And we could say that about a whole range of companies now too. But this idea of going, okay, I'm not against commerciality. I think being commercial is fine. But it's when they kind of get mixed up, when we start to say, actually, the MTC, sometimes STC, are stopping a commercial entity from existing because it's using public subsidy to do that. And what I love when, again, bringing on my David Williamson, where he's saying, actually, we maybe should defund some of these large organisations, let them be the commercial entities that they wish to be, and take that public subsidy and make sure it's all into new Australian work, new Australian writing, that we should maybe really focus. Of course you will agree with that. Of course you will agree with that, because that's all something that we want. But this idea of going, why do we want it? Is because we want that diversity of voices, we want that kind of thing to push ahead and allow then a trajectory to occur, which is the nurturing of it. And then some of us will move into the commercial sphere perfectly well. That's not a bad thing at all. But we'll then have these commercial entities that are about large-scale commercial theatre existing in this country, rather than this half and half kind of way where we are trying to control all voices with a commercial lens versus allowing that diversity of voices to occur.
Yeah. Now, I think everybody can probably see the direction that we're going. So I just want to name it. In the old Playwrights Conference, the National Playwrights Conference, it would always end with a series of resolutions to take forward. Oh. That being a kind of a democratic forum. Now, so put your thinking caps on, because I want to propose two things, and I've asked our wonderful speakers to have a think about this, but I'm going to propose two things. One is that the federal arts budget be tripled to $24 billion a year in order for us to be able to achieve the 1.2% of the GDP that is the average of the OECD countries. So in order for us to get to the average OECD arts budget, we need to triple our arts budget now to $24 billion a year. That's one thing for consideration later. The second thing I want to propose is that all artists get a basic income for being artists. When I first started writing, I'm sure it's true for some of you, I was on the dole for the majority of the first few years of my writing. They didn't hassle me. I wasn't being required to do 10 interviews a week to prove that it was I had the right to get the money. Many of our artists at that time, at the Pram Factory and other places like that, that's how we survived, and it was great. So why can't we do it now? Anyhow, so that's, if you can see where I'm going, triple the budget, so we can do what the Germans do, as was indicated earlier, as I indicated earlier. But just to repeat for those who didn't hear me yesterday, I think I said, why is it that a city that has a population of half of the size of Sydney, i.e. Berlin, can have 500 working theatres open every night, and we can't? We should have that. The opportunities for work. We need to do this work for exactly the reasons that everyone here has been speaking about, in order for us to know ourselves and understand ourselves. Now, coming back to our beautiful speakers, I asked each of you to think or to imagine what a vibrant, exciting cultural scene would look like.
I don't want to go first. That's a big, hard question.
It's a big, hard one. I remember when you raised this question, the word I kept coming up with is the idea of obligation. That in the cultural framework for First Nations people, there is an obligation to the clan, the tribe, the family, the group. And that this idea of obligation to an artistic expression is not just the responsibility of an artist, but in fact all of a nation. So how do we see that obligation manifested for policymakers, for venue managers, for producers and people who run companies, down through all of those amazing layers to those who are creating the work? And ultimately, if the audiences felt obliged and important that they are part of a big cultural project, then they will be part of it. Stepping back, in the 1970s and 80s, I think there was a cultural project about our own identity, about seeing ourselves, hearing ourselves, seeing ourselves reflected, not just being a vassal state to the empire, but being something that is us. And then when that shifted, I think in the, let's call it the late 80s, mostly into the 90s, where we talked ourselves about the kind of economic impact, and you've written about this, Julian.
Too much.
The economic impact and the metrics shifted, and we were actually part of that. We moved away from our cultural obligation to our community to saying, well, if that's the way we get money, if that's the way we centre ourselves, if that's how we get the attention of the decision makers, then we will shift ourselves into that because we will get more things, but we'll keep these other values, won't we? And we've seen those values be kind of squashed, hammered down, pushed away from us. And now we're going, but we want those values back. Yeah, but no, you're all now part of this economic debate and discussion. We even now, I mean, those articles that came out of the Fringe Festival, we're talking about, but we've got this massive big kind of impact economically on the city of Adelaide Fringe. And you're saying, yes, but what's that mean for the artists? The artists who are the big risk takers in your venture. The people who run bars, people who run venues, they're the ones making money. So we see that as more important than artists. And so I just feel like where we're going is, let's go back to this idea of the obligation to our cultural storytelling, to us being together, and so that we see that as a big cultural project. Now, it may have to be reworded, retooled away from just identity to something else. But this idea that that's what I think we need and we may be missing.
Michelle?
I was thinking as Wesley was talking that perhaps at the moment, thinking of what we might need is, I feel like we need some optimism, or we need some reason to be optimistic or hope or something positive, because I think we've all gone through the last few years particularly for theatre. It's been horrendous. It's been incredibly difficult. And I think, bringing people together in spaces that, give you places to speak about the local and the national, perhaps, because I think, that's really important as part of creating something thriving that is about speaking in the local, but also, I think, speaking to the national and kind of finding, I think, if you think about the Uluru Statement, which is, I know Julian mentions it in his book, I think one of the most beautiful things about that is that it is offered as an optimistic invitation, not to politicians, but to the people, to the Australian people. And if you think about that is reason for optimism, that is reason for hope. And it was sort of just squashed, the government just said, no, we're not interested in that. But there are local groups that are kind of thinking about how to make that happen. And at a state level, there are groups that are kind of talking about making that happen. I kind of feel like we have to move beyond that, endless negative, and I don't mean to just ignore the stuff that's wrong. I just mean thinking about it in a way that gives people reason to be hopeful, because I think there is still reason to be hopeful.
Agreed, and that culture is iterative.
Yes.
It's not absolute, and so that the more we participate, the more it gets to shift and change.
Yes.
So if we're in, let's say, the statement from the heart, we're looking for a perfect, absolute outcome, when in fact it'll take us 4 to 5 generations to find what that is.
Yeah.
Let's keep the structures going.
Yeah.
Julian?
It's important to get out of the economic debate, because the economic debate has been used to control us. And there are lots of reasons for that. So it's important not to engage in that and to do exactly as you say, which is to talk in terms of purpose. And then that gives us a more equal conversation, I think. My perception is that this is a complicated time. And, when I meet people and I hear them talk, I can see that they've got all sorts of feelings buzzing around, and that there's a lot going on. And at the end of the book, I talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the social contract. And he said the main problem a democracy faces, people in a democracy, is how to be a people. How to be a people. And you can define it in 2 ways. You can define it externally, in terms of institutions and votes and so forth. But you can also talk about the inner life of a people. And if you think of playwrights, but theatre artists generally, as, let's call them investigators of the soul, then you need to put those artists in the way of traffic. You need to work out a set of conditions where they can fulfill those obligations. by being in the flow. And right now, actually, I think that's a pretty tough job. I don't think that's, I'd give somebody UBI for that. $370 a week, absolutely. Because I have an instinct, it's not just an intellectual thing, I have an instinct that what our drama says about us next is going to be very decisive for what comes next.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think I might, I might open up to questions. Anyone got any questions for the?
We flattened everybody.
That's it. It's interesting. Just what you said this thing about purpose, word too. Like the billions and billions and billions of dollars we're spending on our armed forces has no economic return really.
No.
But there's a purpose. Parliament itself, we invest billions of dollars in governance, and its purpose is basically to keep us governed and represent democracy, but we don't question that. And it's interesting in the arts then, because as soon as you say, let's triple the budget, I go, oh, Stephen, you socialist, you. That's why I love you. But that sense of going, yeah, but it's because we may not have that argument for the purpose as much.
Oh, and it's from Treasury's point of view, it's tiny. It's a rounding error.
Yes.
Yeah, it's nothing.
It's like
couple of parking lots.
Don't even write the memo.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
I look at the risk. That was so terrific. I feel the risk of trivialising. But I can't hear myself. I go to theatre, as a commercial theatre, as well as theatre. And at the moment, and even in the pandemic, Girl from the North Country, Come From Away, Hamilton, I see North by Northwest is on the cards. There is this range, and even at the Adelaide Festival, there was a thing called Girls and Boys, which was an English play. Muriel's Wedding was fabulous. And it had a season and boom. Other things, Ladies in Black and so on. Other Australian productions that are of that quality, much better than Girl from the North, much better than these international imports, never seem to be able to get the audiences they deserve, the runs they deserve. And that serious theatre writers also write in these fields. I could have listed things that they could have done instead of Girls and Boys, with one actress too. That you wouldn't have been expensive. So, what do we have to do to penetrate that commercial world?
It's investment, really, isn't it? It's really about. So, having commissioned Ladies in Black, and then also programmed Girl from the North Country before I went away. Don't. It's fine, I've got thick skin, not a problem. But this whole idea of going, the threshold is so much higher for that initial investment. And that, the notion of, I think Ladies in Black was $1.2 million investment, and we had to get back, with a $500,000 box office. Like that, they're big figures in a subsidised theatre company. But these commercial, something like Girl from the North Country has an initial investment in the $2-3 million in its original production at, which one was it? No, it was the Kevin Spacey company.
Oh, yeah.
There one. That initial investment was so high because it went, we are chasing that. Whereas I think what we do is we apologise right at the very beginning and we don't chase it in the same way. I think Secret River, Andrew, was one of those rare examples where by getting different philanthropists to give, I'm going to say almost $1 million up, or $500,000 to put that in, pushes it up there and keeps it in the public discussion, a work of that scale, and it's very, very rare. And so I think that if we know what our purpose is, we move the resources according to that purpose. And so, maybe it's all right to just do 4 shows a year, but they run for a whole year. these big theatre companies, and we kind of look at that kind of stuff. Or we actually say, here are the 4 big shows we're going to do nationally, and we all agree and collaborate around that. Getting artistic directors to agree.
Yeah.
Why are you laughing?
Yeah.
There is no collective noun for artistic directors because you don't need more than one of them in a room. And there's a sense of going how that kind of collaboration occurs for those works of scale. And ultimately, again, I'm not against commercial theatre. I think commercial's great, can be fantastic for everyone involved. But this idea of how do we invest to get what we want. The RSC, when you think about Matilda, Girl from the North Country, the initial investment, half the stuff that the National would do sometimes would go on and do commercial runs, but we don't think like that in this country in the same way.
I wonder also whether it might be that there may be, there should be more theatre, shouldn't there? I mean, the problem with Australian theatre is that there's not enough. But there may be kind of the issues, like I was thinking, in London, you're just sort of walking over theatres to get to theatres.
True.
Is there something? I wish.
Yeah, let me help you. Ticket price.
Ticket price, but also council regulations about where you can put a theatre.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, but the West End theatres are as expensive to keep empty as they are to keep full. So some of the producers, not all of them, but some of them will adopt a sales maximisation approach rather than a profit maximisation approach, which means that they can drop their ticket prices. And when the National Theatre was dying, which was about 2000, and Nick Heitner took it over, first thing he did was cut all the ticket prices to 10 quid each, and they filled overnight. So there are some economic things here that we are reading as inevitable that are not inevitable. And again, with the commercial thing, what I noticed in America, I taught in upstate New York for a while, is the highly collaborative relationship between the Broadway producers and the small boutique music theatre companies. And the boutique musical was just sort of really kicking in at that particular moment. And the traffic was constant. Everywhere I looked, somebody was doing some awful musical in some... And it was like, come along, because we're pitching this to... And so the pipeline was working, whereas I don't get the impression of artistic collaboration between many theatre companies. Big stays with big, little stays with little. For a country that is not half the size, it's tiny in its population by comparison, that lack of communication is very marked.
All right.
There you go.
I think.
Yeah.
Just a little idea to begin with, Stephen. I remember at NIDA, Edward Albee saying, a good play raises more questions than provides answers. That's a good thought. I'd just like to go back with something that Julian said right at the beginning about unknowing what we know. I think somebody else said that before, some American president or whatever. However, I will come to a question. I was born in 1942. So I was told by my family I was entertaining them in the air raid shelter. So, I can't unknow that. It makes me the person that I am. And I think, and I still have a British passport, I am a dual citizen, but I have a love of country. But for me, it's about loving and belonging. I'm not sure where I belong or what I really love. But it's like, I think somebody said, don't, in one of the currency press's annual talk, said, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
What's the question?
Yes, I will ask the question. So, how would I phrase this? I'd like to hear your opinion on adaptation. because I've always believed that you honour the playwright's intention. And there are some two classical cases in point. The Death of a Salesman of Belvoir. It was about the American dream. You can't set it with in another place and change the accents. It was set in a particular time, as was Julius Caesar. And I've heard the most appalling things about mobile phones and blood all over the place. Is this an excuse because there can't be original? It doesn't work
look,
for me.
I did a play called Black Medea. Good, excellent.
So do I.
Buy more copy. Well, you talk about it in your book.
know.
I did the classic thing. Bought the book yesterday.
Flip through
It's in
to
the
the
book.
bit.
It's in
Did that. But that idea of saying, I think classics can inform us, and that the classics, the difference between, let's say, a lot of the work that Simon Stone did, like Death of the Salesman, Wild Duck, where you go, actually, it's a totally different work in its adapted form. Not just translated, but adapted. And I'm all for it. I think bring it on. I think there's a wonderful vitality in people going, I'm going to take this idea and I'm going to put it through the grinder of what Australia is, the meat grinder of it, as opposed to the gay app. And this whole idea of kind of, I'm going to put it through this process and see what comes out the other side of it. And I think that's fantastic. I mean, what is it? A classic should actually be able to survive through all of those kind of adaptations, because the story at the heart of it is something about the human condition, something that can teach us, something that can help us grow. So, I mean, yes, I love getting offended by, things on stage too, where you go, oh, they can't do that, that's outrageous, that's shocking. But then you have to say, what I'm feeling is the intention of the writer. What I'm feeling, the writer intended for me to feel, or the writer or the director or the creative team. So instead of actually thinking that they're doing it without even noticing they're doing it, I think there's actually an intention behind it. And that might be part of it, going, actually, watching Simon Phillips do all those Shakespeare's where there's mobile phones and there's, it's set like a...
Wigs were very big.
West Wing style versions. He's trying to talk about our contemporary setting through this classical work. And when I did Black Medea, I did exactly that same thing, trying to go, I want to use the Medea story, its structure, it's what it has to say about the world, and I want to put it through the lens that I can provide. Now, totally rewrote that as well, so it's not Seneca or Euripides, it's actually my version of it. But I think that's actually really powerful. And I'm looking forward to, what does it look like in 50 years from now when someone goes back to Don's Party and sets it in a different period of time? What does that look like? I'm keen for that to occur. So I think, again, going back to the idea that culture is iterative, and that sometimes we make mistakes and sometimes it's really great, but whatever you're feeling is intentional, and you should be celebrating that as well.
There's someone up there. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Wesley, could you talk to what Leo Purcell's Drover's Wife does for history?
Oh, well, in a similar way, I think it places a new lens on it and kind of recasts it. Again, it's a totally new work, is it not? It's not actually Drover's Wife. It's Leah Purcell's Drover's Wife, and I think that's really important. It also does that whole thing of makes us visible in that narrative, makes us, Indigenous Australia, visible in the narrative that we accept in the Drover's Wife along the way. Julian, you want to add to that?
Oh, no, not really. I mean, but when I was trying to make this ghastly selection of 50 plays to look at, I did find that there was a division for me between versions of, where
Yes.
there was agency from the artists in a very marked way, in a way that was perhaps similar to a new play, and just sort of, as it were, straight adaptations of the, Charles Dickens on stage, where that relationship is, more about the source material than it is about the target. So there's a range there, and when we say adaptations, it's like an elastic band that stretches across that range. And there's a side of it that I'm personally drawn to because it's part of what comes next, and then there's another part of it which is about something a little bit different. And all I'd say about that little bit different thing is it doesn't have to be the same 9 plays. Ibsen wrote more than just The Doll's House, and there's plenty of Strindbergs to go around, and even some crap Chekhovs if you really want to look for it. So bring them on.
What do you think about Drover's Wife?
Well, I was just thinking about that if we think about that image of Australia, of Australian identity for so long has been the bushman, and the bushman morphs into the surf's lifesaver, who morphs into the digger, Anzac, who morphs into the, that figure has been such a consistent part of Australian culture over time. And I think by taking not that figure precisely, but Lawson himself was so important in the construction of that kind of figure. She takes it on and not only gives it an Indigenous face, but a female face. And I know that Drover's Wife is about a woman, but it is also part of that pioneering, white nationalist kind of tradition of writing. And then by taking it in that different direction, it kind of completely creates, as you say, a new work. And again, that sort of sense of visibility, which I think is really refreshing for people and really kind of bracing in some ways.
And only theatre can do that.
Yeah.
Reclaim and do something new at the same time.
Yeah.
Very nifty.
No. Anyone else?
Oh, there's someone here and there's someone back. Oh, you got it.
I'll start. My question is about government funding, because you were talking about avoiding the economic argument, which I think is really important. I really applaud what Stephen said about funding artists individually rather than projects and companies. And I think that's a major shift that we need to go through in government funding. But my question is about how do you measure cultural worth in a way that governments can understand?
Yes.
Because if you looked at Scott Morrison when he announced the funding for the film industry on the Gold Coast, he talked about all the jobs it would create, he talked about all the income it would bring in. He never mentioned the films they were going to make and the cultural value of them.
Right.
So how do you measure that?
Okay, so that's a problem I've been studying for 10 years. I trained as a political economist and went into the theatre, and sooner or later political economy came back to haunt me. How do you measure cultural worth? Just take it from me. You can't. You can't measure it. Because to measure something, you need a point from which to measure it, and then you need a unit that is commensurable. And I can show you the maths, if you like, and go, you cannot do it. You cannot use a quantitative measure on an analog qualitative spectrum. It does not work. And so you're being lured into a false conversation by having the wrong assumption placed at the heart of the conversation. The other half of it is how do you get governments to, hear the worth, not by pursuing false arguments, because it's never going to work. You are never going to prove it. If that was possible, David Throsby would have done it by now. He created a whole school of economics just to do this. And David, bless him, because I love him, but he's failed. It didn't work. And he was a good friend to the arts, and he really did think it would work. And every time he sees me, I can just see the loathing in his eyes, because he knows that I think he's failed. So there is a point at which you have to reset the conversation, or at least if you're going to pursue the economics, at least understand the economics. At least read a book on modern monetary theory, for example, or have a look at the dozens and dozens of heterodox economic books that are out there now. Then look at the history and realise that economists became dominant in Australia in the Second World War as a way of basically managing national capacity under wartime conditions. And then they kind of maintained their strange hold over politics in the post-war period, but became co-opted to very different political ends. And then once you see that, you kind of go, oh, okay, what we need to do is not change the economics, change the political ends. And I don't know how you do that. I was in Canberra 2 weeks ago, and all the Treasury, Finance, and the Prime Minister's office, which are the big three departments, they all live in that funny little triangle right in the middle. And I was being shown around by Canberra by an ex-coalition advisor, actually, and she was going, "This is the problem. The problem is that they all live in this tiny little bunker." And I think they're a cult. Economists are a cult. So if you join a cult, don't expect to think other than like a cult, because that's what they want you to do. So, yeah. And there's more of that if you want it.
We're just about to finish up. Before we do, I want to do something.
Have you got props?
Oh, lordy.
Oh, where'd it go?
There's a picture of David.
Sorry. When the theatre was bombed in Ukraine the other day, I went onto their website to see what was playing. And here's a little list of it was a large theatre, here's a little list of the things that were playing, that should be playing today. There was a play called Romeo and Jeanette. And its little description is, life has prepared its own fate for everyone. The stars illuminated their different paths. The happiness of each individual seems so understandable. That's one show. The second show was Music of the Heart. When feelings overwhelm, the soul sings. The concert Music of the Heart is about feelings, warm and ardent, passionate and languishing. Another show was Valentine's Day. We are sure that even two completely different worlds can come into contact and merge into a single whole. And the last show that they were performing today was Winnie the Pooh. Did you know that Winnie the Pooh not only sometimes composes chants and screams, but also dances hip-hop perfectly? When I read that, I thought, that's what we do. That's what we in theatre are in contact with. We're in contact with the emotions that enliven us and that make life worthwhile. And fascists hate it and want to kill us. And our resistance is to keep making art. Thank you so much. Thank you.